Alright guys, chapter 10 of The Painted Bird. Chapter 10. German detachments began to search for partisans in the surrounding forest and to enforce the compulsory deliveries. I knew that my stay in the village was reaching its end. One night my farmer ordered me to flee at once to the forest. He had been informed of a coming raid. The Germans had learned that a Jew was hiding in one of the villages. He was said to have lived there since the outbreak of the war. The entire village knew him. His grandfather used to own a large tract of land and was greatly liked by the community. As they said, though a Jew, he was a decent enough fellow. I left late that evening. It was an overcast night, but the clouds began separating, stars sprang out, and the tin white moon revealed itself in all its eminence. I hid in a moon-silvered bush. When dawn came, I moved toward the waving ears of grain, keeping far from the village. My toes were stinging from the thick, scraping blades of grain, but I tried to reach the center of the field. I had to proceed carefully. I did not want to leave behind too many broken stalks that could betray my presence. Finally, I found myself fairly deep in the grain, shivering from the morning cold. I curled into a ball and tried to sleep. I woke to hear rough voices coming from all directions. The Germans had surrounded the field. I clung to the earth as the soldiers strode through the field. The crackling of broken stalks became loud. They almost stepped on me. Startled, they aimed their rifles at me. When I rose, they cocked them. There were two of them, young, in new green uniforms. The taller one grabbed me by the ear and both laughed, exchanging remarks about me. I understood that they were asking whether I was a gypsy or a Jew. I denied it. This amused them even more. They kept on joking. All three of us walked toward the village, I ahead and they laughing directly behind. We entered the main road. Terrified peasants spied from behind the windows. When they recognized me, they disappeared. Two large brown trucks stood in the center of the village. Soldiers in unbuttoned uniforms squatted around them, drinking from canteens. More soldiers were returning from the field, stacking their rifles and sitting down. A few of the soldiers surrounded me. They pointed at me, laughed, or grew serious. One of them walked up close to me, leaned over and smiled straight in my face with a warm, loving smile. I was going to smile back when he suddenly punched me very hard in the stomach. I lost my breath and fell, gasping and groaning. The soldiers burst into laughter. From a nearby hut, an officer emerged, noticed me, and approached. The soldiers snapped to attention. I also stood up, alone in the circle. The officer scrutinized me coldly and issued a command. Two soldiers grabbed me by the arms, dragged me to the hut, opened the door, and shoved me inside. In the center of the room, in semi-darkness, a man lay. He was small, emaciated, dark. His snarled hair hung over his forehead. A bayonet wound split his entire face. His hands were tied behind him, and a deep wound gaped through the cut jacket sleeve. I crouched in a corner. The man fixed me with shining black eyes. They seemed to look out from under his thick, overhanging eyebrows and come straight at me. They terrified me. I averted my gaze. Outside engines were being started. Boots, weapons, and canteens rattled. Commands rang out, and the trucks departed with a roar. The door opened, and peasants and soldiers entered the hut. They dragged the wounded man out by his hands and dumped him on a seat in the cart. His broken knuckles hung limp as on a swaying dummy. We were seated back to back. I faced the shoulders of the drivers. Here the rear of the cart in the receding road. The rear of the cart. That's the man. So the boy was faced the shoulders of the drivers, and the man was at the rear of the cart in the receding road. A soldier sat with the two peasants who drove the cart. From the peasants' conversation, I gathered that we were being taken to the police station in a nearby town. For several hours we rode on a well-traveled road bearing the recent tracks of trucks. Later we left the road and drove through the forest, startling birds and hares. The wounded man sagged listlessly. I was not sure if he was alive. I could only feel his inert body lashed by rope to the cart and me. We halted twice. The two peasants offered me some of their meal to the German, who in return doled out a cigarette and a yellow candy to each of them. The peasants thanked him servilely. They took long draughts from the bottles hidden under the box seat and then urinated in the bushes. We were ignored. I was hungry and weak. A warm, resin-scented breeze drifted from the forest. The wounded man moaned. The horses restlessly tossed their heads, their long tails lashing out against the flies. We moved on. The German on the cart was breathing heavily as though in sleep. He closed his gaping mouth only when a fly threatened to swoop into it. Before sunset, we rode into a small, densely built-up town. Here and there, the houses and brick walls and chimneys. The fences were painted white or blue. Sleeping doves huddled together on the gutter pipes. As we passed the first few buildings, children playing in the road noticed us. They surrounded our slow cart and stared at us. The soldier rubbed his eyes, stretched his arms, hitched up his trousers, jumped down, and walked alongside the cart, oblivious to his surroundings. The troop of children increased. Children jumped out of every house. Suddenly, one of the older and taller boys struck the prisoner with a long birch twig. The wounded man shuddered and drew back. The children got excited and began pelting us with a barrage of rubbish and rocks. The wounded man drooped. I felt his shoulders glued to mine, wet with sweat. A few stones hit me also, but I was a more elusive target, sitting between the wounded man and the drivers. The children were making great sport of us. We were being pelted with dried lumps of cow dung, rotten tomatoes, reeking little cadavers of birds. One of the young brutes began to concentrate on me. He walked alongside the cart and with the stick methodically hit selected parts of my body. I tried vainly to ball up enough saliva to spit into his derisive face. Adults joined the crowd around the cart. They shrieked, "Beat the Jews, beat the bastards," and egged the children on to further attacks. The drivers, unwilling to expose himself to accidental blows, jumped off the box seat and walked along beside the horses. The wounded man and I now provided excellent targets. A new hail of stones struck us. My cheek was cut, a broken tooth was dangling, and my lower lip was split. I spat blood into the faces of those nearest to me, but they leaped back adroitly to aim other blows. Some fiend tore whole bundles of ivy and ferns growing along the roadway out by the root and lashed the wounded man and me. The pain burned at my body. The stones were striking me with more precision, and I dropped my chin on my breast, dreading that some stone might strike my eyes. Suddenly a small, stout priest leaped out of an unprepossessing house as we were passing by. He wore a torn, faded cassock. Flushed with excitement, he burst into the crowd brandishing a cane, and he began to strike at them on the hands, faces, and heads. Panting, perspiring, trembling with exhaustion, he scattered the mob in all directions. The priest now walked alongside the cart, slowly regaining his breath. With one hand he wiped his brow, and with the other clasped mine. The wounded man had evidently fainted, for his shoulders grew cold as he swayed rhythmically like a puppet tied to a stick. The cart entered the courtyard of the military police building. The priest had to remain outside. 2 soldiers untied the rope, took the wounded man off the cart, and laid him down at the wall. I stood nearby. Soon afterward, a tall SS officer in a suit black uniform sauntered into the courtyard. Never before had I seen such a striking uniform. At the proud peak of the cap glittered a death's head and crossbones, while lightning-like signs embellished the collar, a red badge bearing the bold sign of the swastika cut across his sleeve. The officer received a report from one of the soldiers, then his heels drummed against the flat concrete surface of the courtyard as he strode to the wounded man. With the deft movement of the tip of his shining jackboot, he flipped the man's face toward the light. The man looked hideous. A mangled face was a rammed-in nose and a mouth hidden by torn skin. Shreds of ivy, lumps of earth, and cow dung were sticking to his eye socket. The officer squatted close to this amorphous face, which was reflected in the smooth surface of his boot tops. He was questioning or saying something to the wounded man. The bloody mass of face moved like a 1,000-pound load. The thin, mutilated body lifted itself by its tight hands. The officer moved away. His face was in the sunshine now, and it had a sheer and compelling beauty, the skin almost wax-like, with flaxen hair as smooth as a baby's. Once before in a church I had seen such a delicate face. It was painted on a wall, bathed in organ music and touched only by light from the stained glass windows. The wounded man continued rising until he was nearly sitting. Silence lay over the courtyard like a heavy cloak. The other soldiers stood stiffly, gazing at the spectacle. The wounded man breathed hard, straining to open his mouth. He swayed like a scarecrow in a gust of wind. Sensing the nearness of the officer, he listed in his direction. The officer, disgusted, was about to rise from his squatting position when suddenly the wounded man moved his mouth again, grunted, and then extremely loudly uttered a short word that sounded like pig and fell back, striking his head on the concrete. On hearing this, the soldiers quivered and looked at each other, stupefied. The squatting officer rose and barked a command. The soldiers clicked their heels, cocked their rifles, approached the man, and pumped rapid shots into him. The shattered body shuddered and grew still. The soldiers reloaded and stood at attention. Nonchalantly, the officer approached me, beating a swagger stick against the seam of his freshly pressed breeches. The instant I saw him, I could not tear my gaze from him. His entire person seemed to have something utterly superhuman about it. Against the ground of bland colors he projected an unfadable blackness, and a world of men with harrowed faces, with smashed eyes, bloody, bruised, and disfigured limbs. Among the fetid, broken human bodies of which I had already seen so many, he seemed an example of neat perfection that could not be sullied. The smooth, polished skin of his face, the bright golden hair showing under his peaked cap, his pure metal eyes, every movement of his body seemed propelled by some tremendous internal force. The granite sound of his language was ideally suited to order the death of inferior, forlorn creatures. I was stung by a twinge of envy. I never experienced before, and I admired the glittering death's head and crossbones that embellished his tall cap. I thought how good it would be to have such a gleaming and hairless skull instead of my gypsy face, which was so feared and disliked by decent people. The officer surveyed me sharply. I felt like a squashed caterpillar oozing in the dust, a creature that could not harm anyone yet aroused loathing and disgust. In the presence of such a resplendent being, armed in all the symbols of might and majesty, I was genuinely ashamed of my appearance. I had nothing against his killing me. I gazed at the ornate clasp of his officer's belt that was exactly at the level of my eyes and awaited his wise decision. I gazed at the ornate clasp of his officer's belt. The courtyard was silent again. The soldiers stood about obediently waiting for what would happen next. I knew my fate was being decided in some manner, but it was a matter of indifference to me. I placed infinite confidence in the decision of the man facing me. I knew that he possessed powers unattainable for ordinary people. I know that he obtained powers, or that he possessed powers. I know that he possessed powers unattainable for ordinary people. Another quick command rang out. The officer strode off. A soldier shoved me roughly toward the gate. Regretting that the splendid spectacle was over, I walked slowly through the gate and fell straight into the plump arms of the priest, who was waiting outside. He looked even shabbier than before. His cassock was a miserable thing in comparison with a uniform adorned by the death's head, crossbones, and lightning bolts. So he got saved by the priest. Interesting. You know I had to say that joke. The priest is going to use him as like a sex toy. But I was just fucking around. Fucked up story, man. I feel like all these stories are like multiple lives in just one story. You know what I'm talking about? Supposedly this is fiction. But fiction has truth in it. I don't know, his youth is saving him pretty much.